The police chief's cruiser pulled up to my car with its lights off, which should have been my first clue that something had shifted in my favor, but I didn't know that yet. All I knew in that moment was the crushing weight of humiliation. The way Officer Patterson had written out my ticket for tinted windows like I was some kind of criminal, his jaw tight, his pen pressing so hard into his pad, I thought it might tear through. I'd been sitting in that driver's seat for 45 minutes now, the August heat pressing down through the windshield, and I was about to lose my job over a traffic violation. That's the thing nobody tells you about these moments. They don't feel important when they're happening. They feel small and stupid and infuriating in a way that makes you question whether the world has any sense of proportionality at all. But let me back up. Let me tell you about the life I had before everything went sideways, because that's the only way you'll understand why a traffic stop about window tint felt like the universe finally deciding to break me completely. My name is Ashley Mitchell, and I had built a life on rules. Good grades, good job, good reputation. I worked as an HR manager at Westbrook Financial Services, a mid-sized firm in the suburbs of Charlotte, and I was damn good at it. For 8 years, I'd been the person who kept things running smoothly, who handled the difficult conversations with diplomacy, who made sure the company stayed on the right side of every regulation. I made $62,000 a year, which wasn't spectacular, but it was enough. It was enough to pay the mortgage on my 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in the Pinewood subdivision. It was enough to maintain my 401k and my emergency fund. It was enough to feel stable in a way that mattered to me. The kind of stability where you know exactly what your life will look like next month, next year, 5 years from now. I'd bought that house 5 years ago, right after my divorce from Marcus. That's a whole story itself, but the short version is that he wanted to move to Atlanta for his tech job, and I didn't want to go. And we both realized we'd been staying together more out of inertia than actual love. It was amicable. We split the proceeds from the sale of our first house, a starter place we'd bought together when we were both foolish enough to think forever meant forever. The divorce cost me $15,000 in legal fees, but I walked away clean, and I used my half of the proceeds to put a substantial down payment on the Pinewood house. That property became my anchor. It became the physical manifestation of everything I'd worked for. The morning of the incident that started everything, I'd gotten up at 6:30 like I did every morning. I'd made my coffee in the same machine I'd used for 3 years, a Cuisinart that Marcus had given me for our anniversary the year before everything fell apart. I drank it black, 2 cups, standing at the kitchen counter while scrolling through my work emails on my phone. There were 3 messages from my boss, Richard, marked urgent. I didn't open them yet. I'd learned long ago that urgent emails were better read after you'd had your caffeine, after your defenses were up. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street outside. Morning light came through the bay window over the sink, and I could see that my hydrangeas were finally starting to bloom. Big, full clusters of pale blue that I'd been nursing along all spring. I showered, dressed in the charcoal pantsuit I'd pressed the night before, and did my makeup carefully. I've always believed that how you present yourself matters. It's not vanity, it's respect. Respect for yourself, respect for the people you're going to see, respect for the fact that you're choosing to show up in the world in a particular way. My hair is naturally curly, so I blow-dried it straight, applied my moisturizer and SPF, and did my makeup in the precise way I'd been doing it for a decade. Foundation, concealer under the eyes, a light bronze on the lids, neutral lipstick. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make anyone uncomfortable. By 7:45, I was backing my 2019 Honda Accord out of the driveway. The car is gray, understated, the kind of vehicle that blends into traffic. I'd chosen it specifically because it was reliable and forgettable. I did not want to be memorable. I did not want to stand out. I wanted to go to work, do my job well, and come home to my quiet house and my quiet life. The windows of the car are tinted, not darkly, but enough that you can't see clearly inside if you're standing outside looking in. I'd had them done 3 years ago at a shop in the strip mall on Riverside Drive. The guy who did the work had assured me they were completely legal, that they met North Carolina regulations. I'd paid $350 for the job, and had never thought about it again. The drive to Westbrook Financial takes 22 minutes. I take the same route every single day, out of Pinewood, down Lancaster Boulevard, across the Highway 40 overpass, then into the industrial park where the office building sits. The office itself is a 4-story glass and steel structure that looks like 100 other office buildings in 100 other suburbs. When I pull in, I park in my assigned spot, E47 in the employee section, and I walk through the glass doors and I nod at whatever security guard is working that day, and I take the elevator to the 3rd floor where the HR department occupies a corner suite with actual windows overlooking the parking lot and the highway beyond. That morning, August 15th, was like every other morning. I got to my desk at 8:15. My assistant, Jennifer, brought me a printout of the day's calendar. I had 3 meetings scheduled, one with a team lead who was being terminated for performance issues, one with a new hire who needed to go through benefits paperwork, and one with Richard. Jennifer mentioned, almost in passing, that Richard seemed stressed. She's good at reading people, Jennifer is. She said, "He's been in his office since 7. He's had 3 coffees already, and he's been on the phone with someone in a very quiet voice." I told her it was probably nothing. I told her Richard was always stressed about something. I was rationalizing, already, without even knowing what I was rationalizing. I've thought about that moment many times since, how I had the opportunity right then to ask questions, to pay attention to the signals Jennifer was offering, to probe a little deeper. Instead, I opened my email and tried to read whatever those urgent messages said. The first message from Richard was about a compliance issue. There had been a discrepancy in the way bonuses had been calculated for the past 2 years. It was a minor thing, really, just a rounding error that affected about 40 employees. Nothing criminal, nothing that would require regulatory disclosure. The second message said he needed to meet with me at 10 o'clock. The third message, sent at 6:45 that morning, said, "This stays between us until I've had a chance to brief the executive team. Understood?" I understood. I always understood. Understanding was my job. The morning proceeded exactly as it always did. I sat through my termination meeting with Derek Chen, who was a nice enough guy but who simply couldn't meet his sales targets. I explained his severance package, his Cobra health insurance options, and his timeline for leaving the building. He was quiet about it. Most people are when they're shocked. He left my office at 9:45 with a box of his personal items and the business card of the outplacement firm we use. By 9:55, I was refilling my coffee cup and heading down to Richard's office. Richard Chen, no relation to Derek, is a man in his late 50s who has been with Westbrook Financial for 18 years. He's competent, careful, and he has a reputation for being scrupulous about regulations. He's not the type to cut corners. Or at least, I'd always believed he wasn't. When I walked into his office, I found him standing at his window, looking out at the parking lot. He didn't turn around immediately. He just stood there, silhouetted against the bright sunlight, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand was pressed against the glass. "Sit down," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that made the back of my neck prickle. I sat. I placed my coffee cup carefully on the corner of his desk, far enough away that it wouldn't drip on any papers. I folded my hands in my lap, and I waited. This is what I do. I wait. I let the person who's about to deliver bad news deliver it in their own time. I've learned that rushing them only makes things worse. "The bonus discrepancy," Richard said, turning to face me, "that's only the surface issue." "Okay," I said. I already knew this was going to be bad. I could feel it in the way the air in the room seemed to have gotten thicker, harder to breathe. "The real issue," Richard continued, "is that we've discovered someone in accounting has been systematically moving money. Small amounts that wouldn't trigger any audits. But over 2 years, we're talking about nearly $230,000. I felt something cold move through my chest. "Who?" I asked. "That's where this gets complicated," Richard said. He moved back to his desk and opened his laptop. "It's Sarah. Sarah Whitmore, our director of accounting. A woman I'd hired 7 years ago out of a pool of 12 candidates. A woman who I'd personally trained on company culture and benefits. A woman whose performance reviews I'd written, all of them positive. A woman I'd actually considered a friend, or at least the closest thing to a friend you can be with someone you supervise." "How confident are you?" I asked, because I'd learned in 8 years of HR work that sometimes people make mistakes in their analysis. Sometimes they see patterns that aren't actually there. "Completely confident," Richard said. He turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a spreadsheet, And there, highlighted in red, were dozens of transfers. Small amounts, 500 here, 800 there, 1,000 here, all moving from the operational accounts to an account that was registered to a company called Pinnacle Holdings LLC. We had an internal audit done last week. This is all documented, and I've already spoken to our legal counsel. They're recommending we report this to the authorities. I stared at the screen. I couldn't make myself look away from those red highlighted numbers. My hands had gone cold. "When are you going to confront her?" I asked. "That's why I called you in," Richard said. "I want to do it today. I want to do it properly, with you present as a witness, with HR documentation of everything she says. And I want to do it at the end of the day, so we can escort her out before the full staff leaves. I don't want this becoming office gossip." "Of course," I said. "Of course. This was my job. This was exactly what I was trained for. I'd had the difficult conversations. I'd walked people to their cars with their final paychecks and their severance packages and their letters of reference. But this was different. This was Sarah. This was someone I'd thought I knew." "You okay?" Richard asked. He was watching me carefully, and I realized my face must have shown something I didn't intend. "I'm fine," I said. "What time?" 4 o'clock. I'll call her into my office, we'll have the meeting, and then you'll explain her options regarding the police report. We'll give her the opportunity to have counsel present, of course. We'll be fair about this." Fair. As if fairness had anything to do with what was about to happen. As if the fact that we'd given Sarah due process somehow made it less devastating that she'd stolen $250,000 from the people she worked for. The rest of the day moved in this strange, disconnected way. I went through my meetings like an automaton. I smiled at the new hire who was probably going to work for the company for exactly 6 months before getting bored and leaving. I answered emails. I attended a lunch meeting about policy updates. And all the while, I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body, like I was observing some other woman going through these motions. This other woman who had no idea that her entire understanding of her professional world was about to shift. At 3:55, I was back in my office, refreshing my email for the 100th time, when Richard's calendar invitation popped up. Finance meeting, Richard's office, 4 p.m. I had CC'd Jennifer so she knew not to schedule anything during this time. I'd gathered the appropriate forms, the separation agreement, the documentation of her responsibilities regarding company property, the information about severance. I was as prepared as I could possibly be. But as I walked down the hallway to Richard's office at 3:58, I had this strange moment of premonition. There was a feeling in my gut, a sense that something was fundamentally wrong about this day, that once I walked into Richard's office at 4 o'clock, something would shift in a way I couldn't control or predict. I even stopped walking for a moment, standing in the middle of the hallway with my folder in my hand, and I considered just turning around, going back to my office, calling in sick for the rest of the day. But I didn't. I pushed open the door to Richard's office, and I took a seat in one of the leather chairs across from his desk, and I waited for Sarah to arrive. That's the moment when everything was still normal. That's the last moment of my old life, the one where I believed I had control over what happened next, where I believed that if I followed the rules and did my job well, everything would be okay. 30 seconds later, Sarah walked in, and she was smiling, and she had no idea what was about to happen. Sarah walked into Richard's office at 4 o'clock, and I watched her face register the presence of both of us sitting there, waiting. For a moment, her smile didn't falter. She was wearing a navy blazer and heels, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had built a careful, professional life. Then something flickered across her face, some tiny shift in her eyes that made me understand, in that instant, that she already knew. Not the specifics, but the fact that something had shifted. She knew this wasn't a normal meeting. "Have a seat," Richard said quietly, and I watched Sarah lower herself into the chair next to mine, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield. I had practiced what I was going to say. I had written it down, but now that the moment was here, the words felt like stones in my mouth. Richard opened his laptop and turned it toward her without preamble. On the screen were those red highlighted numbers, those small transfers that added up to $230,000. I watched the color drain from her face in real time, first from her lips, then from her cheeks, until she looked like a photograph of herself, drained of blood and life. "These transfers," Richard said, his voice steady and clinical, "match deposits into an account registered to Pinnacle Holdings LLC, an account that, according to our legal counsel, is controlled by you. Would you like to explain?" For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. She stared at the screen like it was written in a language she didn't understand. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, almost childlike. "I can explain," she said, and I felt something inside me twist at the sound of it. I wanted her to deny it. I wanted her to have some reasonable explanation. I wanted anything that would let me believe that the Sarah Whitmore I had hired 7 years ago hadn't been stealing from us the entire time. But she didn't deny it. She reached out with a trembling hand and pointed at the screen. "That first transfer," she said, "that was for my daughter's medical treatment. She has leukemia. We didn't have insurance that covered experimental trials, and she was going to die without them." I felt Richard shift slightly in his chair. I could sense his discomfort, the immediate complication that had just been introduced. But I had been trained for this. I had sat through ethics training and compliance seminars and adversarial interviews. I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew that personal circumstances, no matter how tragic, did not override the fact that she had stolen company money. And yet, as Sarah continued, her voice breaking, telling us about her daughter's remission, about how the treatment had saved her life, about how she had paid back half the money already through a separate account because she couldn't bear the thought of being a thief, but she also couldn't bear the thought of her daughter dying. I felt the solid ground beneath me shift. "How long have you been paying it back?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. 3 years, Sarah said. She looked at me, and there were tears running down her face now. "I've paid back $115,000. I was going to finish by next year. I was going to tell you. I was going to come to you and explain everything, and I was going to pay it all back with interest. And I was just trying to buy myself time to get the money together." Richard leaned back in his chair. I could see him processing, could see the shift in his thinking. The story had complications now. It had a human face. It had a sick child. But we still had legal obligations. We still had to report it. And yet, there was something in Richard's expression that told me he was thinking the same thing I was. That perhaps we had options we hadn't considered before making this meeting official. "Your daughter," I said carefully. "She's in remission?" 18 months, Sarah said, her voice steadier now that she was talking about something other than her crime. "She's 14. She wants to be a marine biologist. She's already looking at colleges." She paused, and then she said something that I knew would haunt me for a long time. "I would do it again. I know that's not what you want to hear. I know I did something wrong. But if it meant she lived, I would do it again in a heartbeat." I excused myself from the meeting after that. I told Richard I needed a moment, and I stood up and walked out of his office and went directly to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall and sat down on the toilet seat and put my head in my hands. This was not supposed to be complicated. This was supposed to be a straightforward case of employee theft, handled according to protocol, with legal notification and proper severance. But it was never going to be that simple again. Not after what I had just heard. When I came back to Richard's office, I found him alone. Sarah was gone. Richard was sitting at his desk, staring at his laptop screen, and he looked older than he had 20 minutes ago. "I called our legal counsel," he said without preamble. "We have options. We can report her to the authorities as required, or we can handle this internally as a civil matter. We can require her to continue making payments with interest on a structured schedule. We can put her on administrative leave while we figure out what that schedule looks like. And we can make it clear to her that if she misses a single payment, we will immediately report the theft and prosecute to the fullest extent of the law." I sat down in the chair Sarah had occupied. "Is that legal?" I asked. "It's ethical gray area," Richard said. "But our counsel says we have discretion. The company isn't required to report employee theft to authorities if we're pursuing civil remediation. We have to be careful. We have to document everything. We have to make it clear that this is conditional on her cooperation. But yes, we can do it." I thought about Sarah's daughter. I thought about Sarah's face when she was talking about college options and marine biology. I thought about the fact that Sarah had been paying back the money, that she had already repaid more than half of what she'd taken. And then I thought about something else, something that had been nagging at me since Richard first showed me those spreadsheets. "Richard," I said slowly, "when did you discover the discrepancy?" He looked at me, confused by the question. "Last week, the audit." "And when was the first transfer?" He turned back to his laptop and scrolled through the numbers. 3 years and 4 months ago. "So it took us 3 years to notice," I said. "We had the internal controls, the oversight, the regular audits, and it took us 3 years to catch it. And when we finally did catch it, Sarah had already started paying it back." I leaned forward. What if this wasn't about Sarah being a thief? What if this was about the company's controls being inadequate? Richard was quiet for a long moment. "What are you suggesting?" he asked finally. "I'm suggesting," I said carefully, "that maybe we focus on how we fix the systems that allowed this to happen in the first place. And I'm suggesting that we give Sarah the opportunity to make this right on a payment plan, contingent on her cooperation with an audit of all her past work. She stays employed, she continues to pay back what she owes, and the company implements better oversight to make sure this never happens again." Richard studied me for a long moment. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the risk assessment, the legal implications, the precedent we would be setting. And then he said, "You know this is going to complicate things. If word gets out that we let her keep her job after this, there could be questions about favoritism." "Then we make sure word doesn't get out," I said. "We document everything. We put her on probation. We require regular audits of her accounts. We make it clear that any further discrepancies will result in immediate termination and prosecution. But we also give her the chance to fix what she broke." Richard nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it that way." That decision, that moment of choosing mercy over protocol, was the hinge upon which everything turned. I didn't know it then, but it was the last good decision I would make in my professional capacity at Westbrook Financial. Because within 2 weeks, the company's financial situation went from stable to catastrophic, and every choice I had made in that moment began to feel like a catastrophic error. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Sarah's confession. Richard summoned me to his office at 7:30 in the morning, before the full staff arrived. His face was the color of old concrete. He told me that our CEO, James Thornton, had been arrested the night before on suspicion of securities fraud. Apparently, the discrepancy we had found in the bonus calculations, the one that had seemed like a simple rounding error, wasn't a rounding error at all. It was part of a much larger scheme. Thornton had been falsifying company earnings reports for years, inflating the numbers to manipulate the stock price and increase his own bonuses. The SEC had gotten involved. There was a federal investigation. And there, at the center of everything, was the discrepancy that Sarah had supposedly created, which now looked like it might have been part of Thornton's attempt to hide the much larger fraud. "Sarah didn't steal that money," Richard said quietly. "Thornton did. He moved it through her accounts to hide it, and when we started asking questions, he was going to let her take the fall for all of it." I felt the room tilt. I felt the solid ground that I had believed myself to be standing on completely disappear. Everything I had done, every choice I had made, was suddenly rendered meaningless. The mercy I had extended to Sarah now looked like a stroke of luck rather than a moral choice. The protocols I had followed, the careful HR documentation, the structured payment plan, all of it became irrelevant in the face of this much larger crime. Sarah called me that afternoon. I had given her my personal cell number as part of the agreement we'd worked out, in case she had questions about her payment plan or her employment status. Her voice on the phone was different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted off her. "I heard," she said, "about Mr. Thornton, about the investigation." She paused. "I just wanted to thank you. If you had reported me to the authorities 3 weeks ago, I would have taken the fall for something I didn't do. I would have gone to prison, and my daughter would have grown up without me. You saved my life. You saved my family." I didn't know what to say. I had made the decision based on what seemed like the ethical choice, not based on what would turn out to be the factually correct choice. I had been right for the wrong reasons. Or maybe I had been right for the right reasons, and the universe had simply aligned to prove it. I genuinely couldn't tell anymore. The scandal that followed was, in retrospect, inevitable. Federal investigators came to the office. They sealed the accounting department. They went through every file, every email, every spreadsheet. And as they did, they found layer after layer of fraud. Not just from Thornton, but from other executives as well. It turned out that the company I had worked for, the company I had believed was scrupulous and careful and above reproach, had been engaged in systematic financial crime for years. And I, in my role as HR manager, had been completely unaware of any of it. The worst part wasn't the scandal. It wasn't the news coverage or the federal investigation or the fact that Westbrook Financial eventually collapsed and was acquired by a larger firm. The worst part was the realization that came to me, slowly and with increasing clarity, that I had been a fool. I had built my entire professional identity on the idea that if I followed the rules, if I did things the right way, if I was careful and competent and thorough, then I would be safe. I would be protected. Everything would make sense. But the truth was, none of that mattered. The rules were theater. The protocols were window dressing. And the people making the decisions at the top, the people I had trusted to lead the company with integrity, were criminals. 2 days after Thornton's arrest, I drove to work in a daze. I had been instructed to come in for an interview with federal investigators. I was not under investigation myself, they had made that clear. But they wanted to understand the internal controls, the reporting structures, the oversight mechanisms. They wanted to know what I had known and when I had known it. And they wanted to understand why, despite all my careful documentation, despite all my protocols, despite my position as the person responsible for ensuring company compliance, I had managed to miss the largest financial fraud in the company's history. I pulled into the parking lot at Westbrook Financial at 7:45 in the morning. The lot was almost empty. There was a security guard at the entrance, a different one from the usual guard, someone from a federal agency by the look of his uniform. I parked in my usual spot, E47, and I sat in my car for a moment, my hands on the steering wheel, and I tried to gather the strength to get out and face what was coming. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a police cruiser parked near the entrance to the building. Not the usual kind of cruiser, not the kind that the local police department used. This was something different. The lights weren't flashing, but the car was clearly official, clearly there for a reason. I watched as a figure got out of the driver's side, and I felt my stomach drop. It was Officer Patterson, the same officer who had ticketed me for tinted windows 3 weeks earlier, on the day that Sarah had confessed to stealing money that she hadn't actually stolen. The same officer who had written out my citation with such obvious contempt, who had treated me like a criminal for having the audacity to have windows that were slightly too dark. He looked directly at my car as he walked toward the entrance, and for a moment, our eyes met through the windshield. I saw recognition flicker across his face, recognition, and something else. Something that looked like confusion or recalibration, as if he was trying to reassess his initial judgment of me based on this new information. Then he turned and walked into the building. I sat in my car for another 15 minutes, my heart pounding, trying to understand what any of this meant. Why was Officer Patterson here? What could the police want with Westbrook Financial? And then it hit me. He wasn't here because of the federal investigation. He was here because someone had filed a complaint. Someone had reported something. And given the timing, given the fact that this was happening on the same day I was supposed to be interviewed by federal investigators, I had a sinking feeling that I knew who that someone was. When I finally got out of my car and walked into the building, I found Officer Patterson standing in the lobby, talking to the security guard. The guard saw me and immediately excused himself. Officer Patterson turned to face me, and there was something in his expression that was utterly unreadable. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying that same flat, professional tone it had carried 3 weeks earlier when he was writing my ticket. "I need to talk to you about a complaint that was filed against you." I felt the blood drain from my face. "A complaint?" I asked. "By whom?" "That's confidential," Patterson said. "But the complaint alleges that you knowingly covered up financial fraud, that you discovered evidence of embezzlement and chose not to report it to authorities, that you made a deal with an employee to keep her employment in exchange for her silence, and that this decision directly enabled a larger fraud to continue unchecked." He paused. "Is any of that true?" I opened my mouth to answer, and then I closed it, because I realized in that moment that I had no idea how to explain the situation in a way that wouldn't make me sound guilty. I had made a decision based on compassion and mercy, a decision that I still believed was ethically correct. But when described in the bare terms of the complaint, that decision looked like corruption. It looked like I had been protecting an employee rather than protecting the company. It looked like I had put personal relationships above professional responsibility. "I need to speak to a lawyer," I said finally. Officer Patterson nodded, as if he had expected that response. "That's probably wise," he said. "The federal investigators are upstairs. They're waiting to interview you. I'm here because the complaint also alleges that you may have been involved in the larger fraud scheme, that you were covering for executives in exchange for salary increases or bonuses or other considerations." He pulled out a notebook. "So before you go upstairs and talk to the federal people, I'm asking you directly. Did you receive any payments or considerations in exchange for overlooking financial irregularities?" "No," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my hands were shaking. "I received nothing. I made the decision regarding Sarah based on my belief that she was a victim of the larger fraud, not a perpetrator of it. And that belief was subsequently proven correct when your federal colleagues discovered that James Thornton had used her accounts to hide money." "Thornton's accounts," Patterson said, making a note. "So you're saying you had no knowledge of Thornton's activities?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," I replied. "And if you speak to the federal investigators, they'll confirm that I fully cooperated with their investigation, and that I was not suspected of any wrongdoing in connection with Thornton's fraud." Officer Patterson closed his notebook. He studied me for a long moment, and I could see something shifting in his face. Some of that initial certainty was draining away, replaced by something more like doubt. "Someone filed a complaint against you," he said finally. "Someone who has access to detailed knowledge of the company's internal operations. Someone who knew exactly what to allege to make you look guilty. Do you have any idea who that might be?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought about everyone I had worked with, everyone I had made decisions about, everyone who might have a grudge against me. And then I realized it didn't matter. Because whoever had filed the complaint, whoever was trying to make me look guilty, they had succeeded. Whether I was actually guilty or not, whether I had done anything wrong or not, the damage had been done. My reputation was now in question. My professional judgment was now suspect. And no amount of cooperation with federal investigators was going to change the fact that someone out there had decided I was an acceptable sacrifice. "I need to speak to a lawyer," I said again. "And I'm not answering any more questions without legal representation present." Officer Patterson nodded. He handed me a card with a phone number on it. "In case you remember anything," he said. Then he turned and walked away, back toward the elevator, presumably to speak with the federal investigators upstairs. I stood in the lobby of the building where I had worked for 8 years, holding that business card, and I felt something shift inside me. The person I had been, the careful, rule-following, protocol-respecting version of myself, had been shattered. And what was left in her place was someone harder, someone angrier, someone who understood, finally and with absolute clarity, that the world did not reward virtue. The world punished it. I pulled out my phone and called the lawyer I had used for my divorce. His name was Martin Hoffman, and he was one of the few people in my life who I actually trusted. When he answered, I told him everything, about Sarah, about the payment plan, about Thornton's arrest, about Officer Patterson's complaint. And when I finished, Martin was quiet for a long moment. "Someone's trying to make you a fall guy," he said finally. "Someone with knowledge of the company's operations and a grudge against you." "Can you help me?" I asked. "Yes," Martin said. "But first, we need to figure out who filed the complaint. And we need to figure out what they know. And we need to figure out why they decided to come after you specifically." Over the next 2 weeks, as federal investigators cleared me of any wrongdoing, and as my lawyer obtained copies of the complaint, we discovered the answer. The complaint had been filed by Richard Chen, my boss, the man who had trusted me with sensitive information, who had made decisions alongside me, who had told me that my choice to extend mercy to Sarah was the right one. He had filed a complaint alleging that I was complicit in financial fraud, that I had made deals with employees to cover up crimes, that I was corrupt. The reason, we discovered, was simple. Richard had known about Thornton's fraud all along. He hadn't known the full extent of it, but he had known something. And he had made a calculation that if he could pin the blame on me, if he could make me look like the architect of the cover-up, then he might escape scrutiny himself. He might be seen as the honest executive who had discovered the fraud and reported it, rather than as the executive who had allowed it to continue unchecked. When I learned this, I felt something cold and crystalline form in my chest. It was anger, but it was also something else, a kind of clarity that I had never experienced before. All the rules, all the protocols, all the careful ways of doing things that I had built my life around, none of it mattered. Because the people at the top, the people who made the rules, didn't follow them. They never had. And the moment you tried to hold them accountable, the moment you tried to do the right thing, they would destroy you to save themselves. I called my lawyer back. "I want to sue," I said. "I want to sue Richard Chen for filing a false complaint. I want to sue Westbrook Financial for wrongful termination. I want to pursue this all the way." "That's going to be expensive," Martin warned, "and it's going to be public. Your name is going to be in the papers. People are going to know about this." "Good," I said. "Let them know. I'm done hiding. I'm done playing by the rules for people who don't even know what the rules are." The lawsuit took 18 months. It was brutal and public and devastating in ways that I couldn't have predicted. But in the end, I won. The court found that Richard had filed a false complaint with malicious intent. Westbrook Financial settled for $250,000. And Richard Chen, who had spent 20 years building a reputation as a scrupulous and careful executive, was forced to resign in disgrace. On the day that the settlement was finalized, I sat in my lawyer's office and looked at the paperwork. $250,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was also, I understood, a price tag on my humiliation, my violated trust, my destroyed professional reputation. It was blood money, and it tasted like ashes. But it was also freedom. I resigned from the new company that had acquired Westbrook Financial. I didn't need the job anymore. I didn't need the stable salary or the careful structure or the illusion of security. I had learned, through pain and betrayal, that security was an illusion. The only real thing was your own strength, your own ability to recognize when you were being destroyed and to fight back. Sarah reached out to me 6 months after everything had settled. We met for coffee at a place near her house, and she brought her daughter, the girl who had leukemia and was now in remission, who was now 14 and who wanted to be a marine biologist. Watching them together, watching the way Sarah's face lit up when she looked at her daughter, I understood that my decision 3 weeks before the scandal had been the right one. Not for the company, not for the rules, not for any of the careful protocols that I had spent my life protecting, but for a human being, for a mother and a daughter, for the thing that actually mattered. "I got into UC San Diego," her daughter said, smiling shyly. "Full scholarship, marine biology program." I felt tears prick my eyes. "That's incredible," I said. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything. For believing in me when no one else did. For taking a chance on mercy instead of following the rules." After they left, I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, nursing a cold cup of coffee, and I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the woman I had been, careful, rule-following, believing that if she did everything right, everything would be okay. I thought about the person I'd become, harder, wiser, understanding that the world operated according to different rules than the ones I had been taught. And I thought about the simple fact that I had been right in the end, not because I had followed the protocols, but because I had chosen to see Sarah as a human being rather than as a data point in a compliance spreadsheet. That was the real lesson. That was what had saved me, ultimately. Not the rules, but the choice to treat people with dignity even when the system told me not to. Even when it would have been easier, safer, more profitable to follow the protocol and let Sarah take the fall for a crime she didn't commit. 3 months later, I was driving to a job interview, a position at a non-profit that focused on workplace ethics and compliance consulting, when I got pulled over by a police officer. My heart sank. I had transferred the title on my car, but I still had the same tinted windows. I waited for the officer to approach, already mentally preparing myself for another ticket. already feeling that familiar surge of anger and injustice. But when the officer approached my window, I saw that it wasn't Officer Patterson. It was a different officer, younger, with kind eyes. He asked for my license and registration, and I provided them. He looked at my window tint, and then he looked at me, and something flickered across his face. "You're the woman from that Westbrook financial case, aren't you?" he said. "Yes," I said carefully. He nodded slowly. "I read about it. About what happened to you. About how your boss tried to make you a fall guy." He paused. "Your window tint is actually legal. It's within state regulations. The officer who ticketed you before made an error. I just want you to know that." He handed back my license and registration. "You have a good day, ma'am." He walked back to his cruiser without writing a ticket. I sat in my car for a moment, stunned, and then I laughed. I laughed until tears ran down my face, because the universe had a sense of irony after all. The ticket that had started this entire nightmare, the small injustice that had seemed so trivial at the time, had been based on a mistake. The officer had been wrong. And now, when I no longer cared about being right, when I no longer believed in the justice of the system, someone was telling me that I had been right all along. I drove to my interview with the nonprofit and I got the job. I started work the following Monday, and my role was to help organizations build ethical compliance systems that actually worked. Systems that didn't just look good on paper, but that actually protected people. Systems that treated employees as human beings rather than as data points. Systems that understood that rules without compassion were just tyranny dressed up in bureaucratic language. It's been 5 years now. Sarah's daughter graduated from UC San Diego and is working as a marine biologist in California. Sarah herself left Westbrook Financial after the scandal and started her own accounting firm. She specializes in working with nonprofits and smaller companies that can't afford expensive compliance infrastructure. We have coffee every few months and we talk about the choices we made and the things we learned. I've never remarried, I've never gone back to corporate work. But I've built a life that feels authentic in a way that my previous life never did. A life where I'm not constantly checking to make sure I'm following the rules correctly. A life where I trust my own judgment and my own moral compass more than I trust the structures and systems that are supposed to protect me. Sometimes I think about Officer Patterson, about that moment in the parking lot when he realized that the woman with the tinted windows was more complicated than he had initially assessed. I wonder if he ever looked back on that interaction and thought about how his initial judgment had been wrong, how his quick assessment of who I was had missed the entire complexity of the situation. I wonder if it taught him anything about the danger of making assumptions, of believing that you can know someone's character from a traffic stop. But mostly, I've learned not to spend too much time wondering about other people's journeys. I've learned to focus on my own path, on the choices I make every day to treat people with dignity, and to trust my own judgment about what's right, even when it contradicts the official rules. That's the real victory in the end. Not the settlement, not the lawsuit, not the clearing of my name, but the understanding that I was never the problem, the system was. And all the careful rule-following in the world couldn't save me from a system that was designed to protect the people at the top, no matter what.